The sun had barely set on the small village where Amahle lived. A woman in her early 30s, Amahle was known throughout the community for her kindness and her dedication to her family. She had grown up in the village, and her heart was deeply tied to its roots. Her marriage to Thabo, a well-respected man in their community, was the talk of the town, often seen as a perfect example of what love should look like. They had built a life together, filled with shared dreams, laughter, and the promise of forever. But Amahle's world was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. One afternoon, when the air was heavy with the smell of rain, Thabo came home with a look she had never seen before. He told her that he had met someone else, a woman from a neighboring village, and that his feelings for her had grown. The words felt like a slap to her face, as if the very foundation of her life had been torn apart in one swift motion. Thabo's voice was cold, his eyes avoiding hers, as he announced that he was leaving. The woman, Zanele, was everything Amahle was not, or so he thought. Young, vibrant, and free-spirited, Zanele seemed to have stolen the love Amahle had worked so hard to build. Thabo couldn't see the tears welling up in her eyes as he walked out the door. His heart had already been lost. The village was silent for a moment, then whispers started to rise. The news spread like wildfire, a gossip that quickly became the subject of every conversation. Amahle, once admired for her strong and loving marriage, was now the woman who had been abandoned for another. It seemed unimaginable. Thabo had been her partner, her best friend. How could he turn his back on her? The community tried to console her, but words failed to ease the pain. At night, Amahle would lay awake, staring at the empty side of the bed, wondering what had gone wrong. She replayed every moment of their marriage in her mind, searching for signs, wondering if she had missed something. She questioned her worth, her beauty, and her ability to keep the love they had once shared. Was she not enough? She wondered. The pain cut deep, but it was the confusion that made everything worse. Amahle was left with the overwhelming feeling that her love had been rejected without warning. The strength she had relied on for years was now crumbling, and she found herself staring into an abyss that seemed impossible to cross. Her heart, once full of hope, was now broken, and the weight of it all threatened to swallow her whole. But this was only the beginning of a story that would test Amahle in ways she never imagined. She had no idea then that this would become the moment she would either rise or remain broken. Her journey had just begun. Months had passed since Thabo left, and Amahle had begun to find herself again, though it felt like an uphill battle. The weight of his abandonment had not vanished, but with each passing day, she grew a little stronger. She had become determined to rebuild the life she had once known, one step at a time. Her friends and family were there for her, offering their support, but it was the community that really helped her begin to heal. The women gathered around her, teaching her new ways to embrace life beyond the shadows of her past. Amahle started taking on new responsibilities within the village, leading the Sunday market preparations, helping with the children's school events, and reconnecting with old friends she had long neglected in the busy days of marriage. It was in these small acts of care that Amahle slowly began to feel whole again, like the fragments of herself that Thabo had shattered were beginning to reconnect. She found solace in the simplicity of village life, the early mornings spent picking herbs in the garden, the laughter of children playing in the fields, and the peaceful moments when she could reflect on her own strength. Though the pain of his departure lingered, she no longer allowed it to control her. Amahle's heart had healed enough to open to new possibilities, and her spirit had regained its former brightness. But even as she was making strides toward independence, Thabo was off to a new beginning of his own. He had moved in with Zanele, the woman he had left her for, and it seemed like the decision he had made was one he was not going to regret. In the early days of their relationship, Thabo was full of excitement and confidence. His social media pages were filled with photos of them laughing together, enjoying the adventures of a fresh start. Zanele was everything Amahle wasn't: carefree, spontaneous, and full of energy. The woman he had once looked at with admiration now seemed to be everything he had hoped for in a partner. He convinced himself that he had made the right choice. Zanele gave him the thrill he craved, and he believed that their love was the one that would last. But as time passed, cracks began to show. He found himself missing the peace Amahle had brought into his life, the quiet strength that only she possessed. He noticed the little things about Zanele that annoyed him, things he had overlooked in his excitement to escape the life he had built. Yet, Thabo remained stuck in a relationship where his initial happiness started to wear thin, and a nagging feeling of regret began to claw at him. Amahle was no longer his, and despite his confidence in the new life he had chosen, he couldn't shake the growing emptiness he felt inside. Back in the village, Amahle was still rebuilding, still growing, but her heart was a battlefield. She longed for peace but was torn between the strength she had gained and the ghost of the love she had lost. It was not easy to move forward. Some days, she wished she could erase the memories of her life with Thabo, while other days, she caught herself daydreaming about what could have been. The life she had once envisioned felt so distant, yet the love she had poured into him was still a part of her, tangled in her emotions. Her desire for independence and freedom clashed with the pain of his absence. Amahle struggled with the lingering question, could she ever truly let go of the past? The temptation to reach out, to ask for answers, to find closure, weighed heavily on her. But she knew that her journey forward would require her to let go of the memories, of the anger, and most of all, of Thabo. Amahle was learning that moving on wasn't about forgetting the past, but about growing through it. Her journey had just begun, and though the road ahead was uncertain, Amahle knew one thing for sure: she was no longer the woman Thabo had left behind. She was becoming someone stronger, someone who could stand on her own, ready to embrace whatever life had next in store. As the season shifted, Thabo's excitement over his new life began to fade. The thrill of a fresh relationship, once full of promise, started to wear off. The carefree energy that Zanele had brought into his life no longer seemed so appealing. There were moments, quiet, fleeting moments, when Thabo found himself reflecting on what he had lost. The laughter they shared in the early days of their marriage now felt like a distant memory, and he started noticing flaws in his new relationship. Zanele, although vibrant and full of energy, did not offer the same peace that Amahle had. Thabo found himself irritated by small things: her impatience, the way she never took the time to understand the deep, unspoken bond he and Amahle had shared. He remembered the comfort of being with Amahle, her calming presence after a long day, her quiet wisdom that made him feel understood without words. Zanele, despite her beauty and excitement, couldn't fill that emptiness. The love he had so recklessly discarded felt like an unhealed wound in his chest. What had seemed like a bold choice now felt like a reckless decision. Thabo began to question himself. How had he ever believed that Zanele could replace the depth and stability Amahle offered? Every time he tried to move forward, the shadow of his past loomed over him. Meanwhile, Amahle was beginning to grow stronger. Her heart, though scarred, was no longer broken in the same way it had been. She had found a strength she hadn't known she had, a quiet confidence that radiated through everything she did. She spent her days pouring her energy into the village, into her work, and into herself. She no longer sought Thabo's approval or love. His abandonment had taken away much, but it had also given her a gift, a deep sense of self-worth that she hadn't realized she was capable of. The community admired Amahle for how she had bounced back. She was no longer the woman who had been left behind but a force of her own. Her days were filled with purpose and her nights with peace. Amahle had learned to lean on the people who cared for her, her family, her friends, and the village that had always been her refuge. They saw her not as a victim but as a survivor, a woman who had turned her pain into a source of strength. Yet, despite this newfound strength, there were moments when Amahle felt the sting of doubt. When she was alone at night, memories of Thabo would flood back, and she would question if she had made the right choice in moving forward. Could she ever truly let go of the man she had loved so deeply? Was there still a place in her heart for forgiveness? It was during these moments of solitude that she would search for peace within herself, reflecting on how far she had come. But Amahle didn't let these moments define her. She understood that healing was not a straight path but a winding road filled with ups and downs. She had learned to trust in herself more than ever before, and the doubts, though painful, no longer had the power to control her. Each day, she grew a little more confident, a little more free. As Thabo's regret deepened, he tried to contact Amahle, hoping for reconciliation. He missed her strength, her wisdom, and her love. But Amahle was no longer the woman he had abandoned. She had found herself again, and while she was not immune to the occasional pang of sorrow, she knew that she was far better off without him. She no longer sought his validation. Her heart, though scarred, was now her own to heal and protect. In this part of her journey, Amahle realized that her life, no matter how painful, was hers to shape. She had the power to decide who she wanted to be, with or without Thabo. Her strength was not in forgetting the past, but in choosing to move forward with dignity and self-respect. It had been over a year since Thabo left, and life for Amahle had shifted in ways she never thought possible. The weight of the past was no longer a burden, it had transformed into strength. Her heart, once shattered, had healed piece by piece, and she had come to understand the power of self-love. The village no longer saw her as the woman left behind, they saw her as a woman who had built herself up from nothing. But one day, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Thabo returned. His face, once confident and assertive, now carried the weight of regret. His clothes were more worn, his eyes were tired, and his posture sagged with humility. It wasn't the man who had walked out of her life so many months ago. This was a man who had learned the hard way that life, love, and choices were not to be taken lightly. He stood before her, awkward and vulnerable, as the words stumbled from his lips. "I made a mistake," Thabo said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I left you for someone else, but I've learned that no one can ever replace what we had. Amahle, I am so sorry. I was wrong to hurt you. I should have never left." The apology hung heavy in the air, but Amahle didn't react immediately. Her heart, once so eager for his love, now beat to a different rhythm. Thabo's regret was visible, but so was the time he had lost. He continued, desperation creeping into his voice. "Please, I've come to ask for a second chance. We can rebuild what we lost. We can be happy again, together. Please, Amahle. I can't live with the regret any longer." But Amahle didn't move. She stood still, her mind racing as she took in his words. The man who had left her, who had broken her, was standing there asking for forgiveness. The man who had abandoned her to chase a fleeting thrill now begged her to return to the life they once shared. It was almost as if he expected things to fall back into place just because he had asked for it. But Amahle had changed. She wasn't the woman who had once been consumed by grief and confusion. She had grown stronger, wiser. The village had seen it, and she had felt it deep within herself. She wasn't angry anymore, but she wasn't the same person she had been when he left either. Amahle took a long, steady breath, her gaze unwavering as she looked into Thabo's eyes. She knew the decision before her was monumental. Not just for him, but for her own future. She had learned to stand on her own 2 feet, to carry the weight of her own dreams and to chart her own path. He had walked away once, and now he wanted to come back as if time had stood still. But Amahle knew that nothing was as simple as it seemed. The silence between them grew longer, and Thabo shifted uncomfortably. "Please, Amahle. I love you. I know I hurt you, but I want to make it right. I can't keep living with this regret. I was foolish, and I'm sorry." Amahle looked at him, her heart softening, but her resolve firm. She was no longer dependent on him for her happiness. The question swirling in her mind was no longer about whether she could forgive him, it was about whether she could trust herself to go back to a life with him. Amahle had changed, but was there still room for him in her life? Was it wise to let the past back in, to risk the happiness she had worked so hard to find? Her mind swirled with conflicting thoughts. On one hand, Thabo was the man she had loved deeply. He had been her everything. Could she really let go of that? Could she risk allowing him to hurt her again? On the other hand, Amahle had rebuilt her life from the ground up. She had learned to stand tall, independent of him. The life she had now, though scarred, was hers, untouched by his betrayal. The choice before her wasn't just about Thabo, it was about Amahle herself. She had to decide whether her peace, her strength, and her future were worth sacrificing for a second chance with someone who had once left her broken. The days following Thabo's return were filled with silence. Amahle didn't rush her decision, despite the weight of his words and the depth of his regret. She needed time to reflect, to truly understand her feelings, and most importantly, to honor the woman she had become. Thabo's presence was a reminder of the past, of the love she had once given so freely, and of the hurt that had followed. But it was also a reminder of how far she had come, how much she had grown in his absence. As she sat under the vast African sky, Amahle thought about all that she had endured. She had lived through the pain of betrayal, the loneliness that followed his departure, and the struggle to rebuild her life. Through all of it, she had found strength not in him, but in herself. The quiet moments of reflection, the friendships that had helped her heal, and the quiet power of living for herself had taught her more than she could have ever imagined. Amahle had become a woman who knew her worth, who understood that love wasn't about waiting for someone else to complete her, but about finding completeness within herself. She wasn't the same woman who had depended on Thabo for her happiness. She had discovered that true happiness came from self-respect, from understanding her own value, and from the freedom of living a life she had created with her own hands. When she finally spoke to Thabo, her voice was calm, steady, and full of clarity. "Thabo," she began, her eyes meeting his with a quiet strength, "I loved you. I gave you everything I had. But you chose to leave me, and in doing so, you showed me that I am not defined by anyone else. I am not defined by the love I gave you, or the life we had together. I have found myself, and I have learned to stand tall on my own. I am not the same woman you left behind." Thabo's eyes filled with sorrow, but there was nothing he could say. The damage was done. He had taken her love for granted, and now, no matter how deep his regret ran, he couldn't undo the past. His actions had consequences, and those consequences were irreversible. He had lost the woman he once held dear, and in his quest for another life, he had discovered that nothing could ever replace the quiet beauty of the life he had once shared with Amahle. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking, but Amahle could see the truth in his eyes. He had finally come to terms with what he had lost. But the regret, though unbearable, was no longer something he could fix. Amahle had already moved forward, and in that movement, she had found a peace he could never give her. Amahle smiled softly, her heart full of understanding. "It's too late, Thabo. But I thank you. You gave me the greatest gift of all, the chance to discover who I truly am. I am not the woman you left behind. I am the woman who chose herself." With those words, Amahle walked away, not in anger or bitterness, but in complete empowerment. She had made her decision, and it was the right one. She knew her worth now, and that knowledge was more valuable than any apology, more precious than any regret. As the sun set over the village, Amahle looked out at the horizon, knowing that her journey had only just begun. She had learned to love herself, to stand strong in the face of heartbreak, and to never again let anyone else's actions define her. She was a woman of strength, a woman who knew her worth, and nothing could take that away from her.